Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we distill complex information into essential, captivating knowledge. Today, we are exploring one of the rarest, most profoundly unsettling neuropsychiatric conditions known to science. A state of being so bizarre it has been dubbed walking corpse syndrome.
It's a really chilling phenomenon, formerly known as Cotard syndrome or Cotard's delusion.
Right.
We are talking about an absolute fixed belief, a nihilistic belief, really, that the patient is deceased or dying or putrefying.
Putrefying.
Yes, or that fundamental components of their physical self, their blood, their organs, maybe even their soul, have simply ceased to exist. I mean, for these patients, objective reality has basically been replaced by this subjective experience of non-existence.
That denial seems central. We're not just talking about, a metaphor for depression or feeling really down.
Oh, not at all.
This is like an ontological collapse, a genuine belief they have no being.
Exactly. The patient genuinely believes they don't exist. And this syndrome, although it's incredibly rare, it actually has quite a long history. It's named after the French neurologist Jules Cotard.
Cool.
He first described this cluster of symptoms way back in the 1880s.
What did he call it initially?
He called it le délire de négation.
The delusion of negation.
Precisely. And that phrase, it really captures the essence, doesn't it? The patient just systematically negates everything, their body, their life, sometimes even the world around them.
Wow.
It's important for you listening to understand the clinical status of this condition today. It is exceedingly rare. Like, we only have documented records of about 200 cases globally.
200? That's tiny.
It really is.
So given it's so rare and maybe seems more like a severe symptom than a distinct illness, how does it fit into modern diagnosis? Is it in the big manuals?
That's a key point. It is not listed as a specific standalone disorder in the major classification systems like the DSM-5 or the ICD-10. Clinically, it's typically seen as a central feature, maybe a mood-congruent delusion happening within some other primary underlying disorder.
Usually depression.
Very often, yes.
Yeah.
Particularly severe depression with psychotic features. But, and this is crucial, recognizing this unique configuration of nihilistic beliefs is still incredibly important.
Why is that?
Because it points towards some very specific mechanisms in the brain, you see. And it profoundly affects both the prognosis and the kind of treatment that's needed. The underlying cause? Well, that guides the intervention strategy.
Right.
But the delusion itself, that dictates the immediate, sometimes life-saving urgency.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive. We've gathered a pretty substantial stack of research on this profound topic. Okay, let's really try to unpack this. We want to explore the complex spectrum of these, frankly, terrifying nihilistic symptoms. Then, look into the surprisingly wide range of underlying causes. It's not just depression, is it?
No, far from it. Brain injuries, infections, even drug toxicity.
Exactly. And then we'll dive deep into the science, trying to explain how this feeling of non-existence actually gets manufactured in the brain.
The pathophysiology.
Right. And finally, we have to look at the urgent therapeutic pathways, the treatments that are needed to, well, quite literally bring someone back to life.
So when we examine the core phenomenology, the defining feature of Cotard syndrome is these nihilistic delusions.
The belief they're dead.
Dead, non-existent, or putrefying, yes.
Yeah.
The patient might insist they've lost fundamental physical parts like they have no blood, no nerves, no stomach, no heart.
Gosh.
Or sometimes, though it's more rare but incredibly profound, they might believe the external world itself has ceased to exist.
I remember reading about a patient who claimed they were just a dead plant. Like neither really alive nor truly dead, just inert, decaying matter.
That's a powerful image, isn't it? It speaks to the ultimate denial of personal agency and vitality.
Absolutely.
And that idea of inert existence, it leads us to one of the most intellectually challenging aspects of the syndrome.
Yeah.
Which the strained co-occurrence of this nihilistic negation.
Yeah.
And delusions of immortality.
Like, immortality, that seems completely contradictory. If you think you're dead, how can you also feel immortal?
It seems counterintuitive, right? It's the ultimate mind twist, as some sources call it.
How does that work? Logically, if you're already dead, what's left to kill?
That's exactly the bizarre logic. The thinking goes something like this. Death is the final limit, the end point of existence.
Okay.
If the patient believes they've already passed that limit, maybe through literal death, or maybe through the negation of their internal systems, then the normal rules of decay and mortality just don't apply to them anymore.
So they're beyond death.
In their minds, yes.
Right.
They're beyond the reach of the forces that govern the living. It's fascinating. In that large 100-case review by Barrios and Luque,
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Well, they found that 55% of the patients in their cohort presented with delusions of immortality alongside their core nihilistic beliefs.
Over half.
Over half. It's like they're stuck in this eternal, horrific kind of purgatory.
That 100-case review sounds like a really key piece of work for understanding the clinical picture. Let's dig into that data more. What does it tell us about the other symptoms that usually show up? Because it sounds like it's rarely just the nihilism.
That analysis gives us a really crucial snapshot. Overwhelming depressive mood is, by far, the most prominent associated symptom. It was found in 89% of the patients studied.
89%.
Yeah. So that confirms that for the vast majority, Cotard's is deeply intertwined with a severe affective state, a severe mood problem.
Okay.
This is followed by the core nihilistic delusions we've been talking about concerning their own existence. Those were present in 69%.
So nearly 9 out of 10 are profoundly depressed, but the specific I am dead belief is closer to 7 out of 10. The depressive weight is even more common than the literal negation.
Precisely. The data really shows this deep integration with generalized psychological distress. High rates of anxiety are also found 65% of cases.
Anxiety makes sense, I suppose.
And also crucial are the delusions of guilt, present in 63%. This is often a very melancholic guilt. The patient might believe they're damned or rejected by God, or that they somehow deserve this state of non-existence because of some past sin, real or imagined.
So the profound sadness, the melancholia, actually shapes the content of the delusion itself. It's not just feeling bad, it's feeling deservedly non-existent.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, we see a high rate of hypochondriac delusions. That was 58% of cases.
Believing they're physically ill.
Right. Believing they have some terrible physical illness or that their organs are literally putrefying or decaying inside them. It's almost like the biological expression of their internal despair.
Wow.
And we should also note, while the denial of the self, body, soul existence is central, sometimes, as we touched on, the negation extends outwards to extrapersonal space. The patient might deny the existence of the world, their family, or objective reality itself.
It's like a collapsing reality. Does it tend to happen suddenly or build up over time?
It's usually progressive. It doesn't typically hit all at once. Researchers like Enoch and Trethuan described a typical clinical course that can be quite gradual.
How does it start?
It often starts in the early stages, sometimes lasting weeks or even years, with this vague but really profound feeling of anxiety. Existential unease, you might call it.
Just a general sense of wrongness.
Exactly. This anxious state then gradually deepens, often taking on a more melancholic, depressive tone, before it eventually kind of crystallizes. It cements into the full-blown nihilistic delusions.
Oh.
The specific denial of life or body parts then becomes the dominant fixed feature. The speed can vary a lot between individuals, but that slow spiral from anxiety to negation is considered pretty classic.
Given how complex the presentation is, I mean, some patients are mostly anxious and guilty. Others seem purely nihilistic, collegial. Doctors must need some way to categorize these variations, right, to help guide treatment.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to that classification system proposed by Berrios and Luke.
The 3 types.
Yes, their tripartite classification is really practical, even if it's not in the formal diagnostic manuals. It helps clinicians quickly get a sense of the balance between the mood disturbance and the pure delusion.
Okay, walk us through those 3 types. How do they differ?
Sure. So the first category they proposed is psychotic depression.
Okay.
This presentation is dominated by the depressive and anxious elements we just talked about. Patients here primarily show those melancholic delusions of guilt, and they frequently have auditory hallucinations as well.
Hearing voices.
Yes. And while some nihilistic ideas might be present, they're kind of secondary. They're overshadowed by the severe melancholia and the overall depressive state.
So in this type, the main clinical issue is really the mood disorder, and the nihilism is sort of riding shotgun, so to speak.
It's a good way to think about it, yes. Now, contrast that with the second type, Cotard syndrome type I.
Type I.
This is considered the purer form. Here, the clinical picture is dominated by the hypochondriac and nihilistic delusions themselves.
So the I'm dead, I have no organs stuff is front and center.
Exactly. The patient is insisting they are dead, missing organs, decaying. But remarkably, often without prominent depressive episodes or severe anxiety.
Really? No depression?
or at least much less prominent. This presentation is much closer to what you might think of as a pure delusional disorder.
That is a critical distinction, isn't it? A patient who is perhaps quite calmly convinced they are a ghost, not necessarily suffering that crushing emotional agony we associate with severe depression.
Precisely.
Does that suggest something different might be going on in the brain?
It absolutely does. The presence of type suggests that the underlying fault might be more direct, maybe more localized, perhaps a functional or structural issue that's specifically disrupting the perception of self and reality without necessarily involving the brain's broader mood regulation circuits.
So maybe more cognitive or perceptual rather than purely emotional or affective?
That's the implication, yes.
It's fascinating.
And the third category.
That is Cotard syndrome type 2.
Yeah.
This is the mixed presentation.
And honestly, this is often the most challenging group clinically. They feature a combination of prominent anxiety, depression, auditory hallucinations, and the nihilistic delusions.
All of it together.
All of it. And critically, this group carries a very high risk of suicidal behavior. Most of the really urgent, high-risk case reports you read about tend to fall into this type 2 category, where the mood problems, the psychosis, and the nihilism are all tightly interwoven.
And knowing which type you're dealing with must really influence the treatment approach?
Immediately.
Yeah.
It helps decide whether you start with, say, an antidepressant-antipsychotic combination, or if the situation is so severe, you need to consider more aggressive interventions, like electroconvulsive therapy, right from the start.
Okay, so we've established that Cotard's isn't really a disease itself, but more like a symptom package, a manifestation of some underlying disorder.
Exactly.
Which means finding that primary cause is absolutely critical. And what's fascinating, as you alluded to earlier, is just how varied these causes can be. It's not just psychiatry. It involves neurology, systemic infections, even pharmacology.
That's really the core takeaway for this part of our deep dive. Cotard syndrome demands a comprehensive diagnostic workup. You have to look beyond the obvious psychiatric symptoms.
Because if you don't...
Because if you only treat the depression, for example, you might completely miss a potentially treatable organic cause, like a brain tumor or stroke, or even a severe drug reaction.
Right. Let's start with the primary psychiatric associations, the ones that are most common, the sort of usual suspects.
Okay. The vast majority of cases, we said, nearly 90% earlier, are tied to either unipolar or bipolar depression, often with severe psychotic features.
That link is very strong.
Extremely strong. However, the syndrome also shows up in the context of schizophrenia, other general psychotic disorders, catatonia, and even dissociative disorders. Really, the presence of such a bizarre, fixed delusion often signals a profound break with reality, regardless of the specific underlying mood state.
You mentioned earlier a specific finding related to age, suggesting a pattern in younger patients.
Yes, that's quite significant. For patients diagnosed under the age of 25, studies strongly suggest an increased risk of bipolar disorder being the underlying condition.
Why bipolar specifically in younger people?
Well, emerging bipolar disorder in adolescents and young adults is often characterized by these really extreme shifts in mood and sometimes very unusual psychotic features that don't fit neatly into other categories.
Okay.
So the thinking is that this nihilistic delusion might represent an early, particularly severe manifestation of that emerging mood dysregulation. It could be linked to the rapid neurochemical changes happening in the brain during that developmental period.
That's a really important clinical flag then for doctors working with younger people who present with this kind of delusion.
Definitely.
Now, let's talk about the overlap with other syndromes. You mentioned this briefly, but it seems really key for potentially pinpointing the specific brain circuits involved.
It is fascinating, yes. The reported co-occurrence with other delusional misidentification syndromes is particularly telling. The most commonly noted overlap is with Capgras delusion.
Capgras, that's the one where people believe someone familiar, like a spouse or a parent, has been replaced by an identical-looking imposter, right?
Exactly that. The person looks right, but they don't feel right, so the brain invents the imposter explanation.
So if Cotard's and Capgras might share some common fault line in the brain's machinery, why doesn't everyone with Cotard's also think their family are imposters? What makes the difference between negating the self versus substituting others?
That is a critical question.
Yeah.
And it points directly towards this proposed role of premorbid personality, specifically attributional style.
Attributional style, how you explain things.
Sort of, yeah, where you tend to place blame or find causes. The neurological fault line probably involves that pathway, connecting recognition, seeing a face, feeling your body, to the emotional affective response. the feeling of familiarity.
The is this known, is this mine feeling.
Precisely. If that affective connection gets severed or damaged, the patient is left with this highly improbable observation. This person or this body looks correct, but feels profoundly wrong or unfamiliar.
And the brain absolutely has to invent an explanation for that disconnect.
It has to. Researchers propose that the difference in the delusion Cotard's versus Capgras lies in where the patient tends to attribute the cause of that wrongness.
Okay.
Patients with an internal attributional style, people who are generally prone to self-blame or introspection when things go wrong, they tend to develop Cotard's syndrome.
Ah, so they look inward.
Exactly. They think the world feels unreal or my body feels wrong. Therefore, I must be the problem. I must be dead or rotten or non-existent. And this fits perfectly with that high co-occurrence of depression and guilt we talked about.
They rationalize the weird sensory input by essentially destroying the self-concept.
That's the idea. Conversely, patients with an external attributional style, those who are more prone to blaming outside factors, maybe more towards paranoia, they seem more vulnerable to developing Capgras.
So they think.
They think, this person feels wrong. It can't be me that's the problem, therefore they must be an imposter. They've been replaced.
Wow. So the underlying neurological glitch might be similar to that broken emotional familiarity circuit, but the personality directs the content of the delusion.
That's the leading hypothesis. And we also see reported co-occurrence, though less commonly, with things like Frigoli delusion.
Where you think different people are actually the same person in disguise.
Right. And even lycanthropy, the delusion of being a werewolf, and hydrophobia, which is usually linked to rabies but can appear delusionally. All this overlap supports the idea of some shared vulnerability in the brain's core identity and reality processing centers.
Okay, this is where, as you said, it gets really interesting, moving beyond the psychiatric labels to the physical, organic triggers. The sheer variety of physical conditions that can apparently cause this specific psychological collapse is just astonishing.
It really is. And the list of associated neurological and organic causes is long, which truly underscores the syndrome's neuropsychiatric roots. It's not just in the mind.
What kind of things are on that list?
Well, we see associations with structural brain conditions.
Yeah.
Things like different forms of dementia, especially frontotemporal dementia or atrophy.
Shrinkage in the front and temporal lobes.
Yes. Also brain tumors, cerebral infarction, which is stroke superior sagittal sinus thrombosis, which is a type of blood clot in the brain, and cerebral arteriovenous malformations, AVMs.
Let's pick one of those. How might something like frontotemporal atrophy lead specifically to the feeling of being dead?
Well, the frontal and temporal lobes are absolutely crucial for integrating sensory information, memory, and really importantly, generating our sense of self-awareness and emotion.
Okay.
So frontotemporal atrophy can specifically disrupt the neural networks that connect those emotional processing centers, like the limbic system, to the executive control centers in the prefrontal cortex. If those connections start to degrade,
Its signal gets lost.
the continuous unified narrative of I am me, I am present, I feel alive, can basically shatter. This can lead to profound depersonalization, feeling detached from yourself, which the brain then might try to rationalize with the ultimate explanation. I must be non-existent.
And epilepsy, you mentioned that too.
Right. Epilepsy, particularly when it involves the temporal lobe or the limbic system areas deep inside involved in emotion and memory, can trigger intense, often very bizarre, altered states of consciousness during or after seizures.
So the seizure itself could cause it.
It could be the seizure activity itself, or it could be linked to postictal depression. That's the severe depressive state that sometimes follows a major seizure. The intense electrical storm of the seizure might temporarily or sometimes even permanently disrupt the brain circuitry responsible for generating that feeling of being alive, pushing the patient into a nihilistic state.
And we absolutely have to talk about the impact of traumatic brain injury, TBI. That gives us that really vivid case example, doesn't it?
It does. TBI is a significant trigger because physical trauma can directly damage those critical frontotemporoparietal areas we've been discussing.
The Scotsman example.
Yes, the anecdote of the Scotsman who suffered a serious head injury in a motorcycle accident. It illustrates the brain's interpretive failure perfectly. After the injury, he became completely convinced that he had died.
From the injury?
No, he believed he died either of sepsis or possibly AIDS, contracted from the hospital treatment.
Okay.
And then his family, trying to help, took him to sunny South Africa, thinking a warm, healing environment might do him good.
But it backfired.
Massively. The intense heat there only served to confirm his delusion.
He didn't feel better. He felt worse. He used the heat to rationalize his internal state.
Exactly. He concluded that the intense heat was proof positive that he hadn't just died, he'd been taken to hell.
Oh my goodness.
He even reportedly hallucinated that he had borrowed his mother's spirit to show him around hell. It just shows how the brain takes this fragmented, maybe confusing sensory input like the oppressive heat, filters it through this broken existential lens caused by the TBI, and constructs this terrifying, personalized delusion of the afterlife.
That's incredible. So beyond structural damage like TBI or atrophy, we noted infectious causes, and even modern ones like COVID-19 reported as triggers.
Yes, it's a reminder that any significant systemic inflammatory event can potentially impact brain function, and in rare cases, trigger neuropsychiatric symptoms like this.
But perhaps the clearest, most instructive organic cause involves medication toxicity.
This is probably the most direct example we have of a specific chemical trigger, and crucially, a direct reversal of symptoms.
Which medication?
Cotard's has been reported as an adverse drug reaction to the antiviral medication acyclovir and its prodrug, valacyclovir. These are very commonly used drugs, often for herpes infections like shingles or cold sores.
Why would an antiviral drug cause someone to feel like they're dead? That seems completely unrelated.
The mechanism seems to be tied to how the drug is processed and cleared by the body. Acyclovir is broken down into a metabolite called 9-carboxymethoxymethylguanine, or CMMG for short.
Okay, CMMG.
In patients with normal kidney function, this CMMG metabolite is quickly filtered out by the kidneys and excreted. No problem.
But if the kidneys aren't working well?
Exactly. If a patient has impaired renal function, perhaps due to age or kidney disease, this CMMG metabolite can build up in the blood to toxic concentrations. And crucially, it seems able to cross the blood-brain barrier.
So high levels of CMMG in the brain lead directly to nihilism.
It appears so. While the precise neurochemical target of CMMG that causes the Cotard symptoms is still being researched, we know that high concentrations of this substance can acutely disrupt normal neurotransmitter function in the brain. It might interfere with pathways regulating perception, mood, reality testing, basically causing an acute brain dysfunction that manifests as these nihilistic delusions.
And the reversal.
What's absolutely stunning is the treatment in these specific cases. Performing hemodialysis, basically artificially filtering the blood to remove waste products, effectively clears the toxic CMMG from the patient's system.
And the symptoms go away?
Reports show that hemodialysis can rapidly and completely resolve the Cotard symptoms in these acyclovir-induced cases.
That instant reversal tied directly to clearing a specific chemical is incredibly powerful evidence, isn't it?
It really is.
It shows that, at least in some instances, this profound feeling of non-existence might be essentially a temporary form of brain poisoning.
It's perhaps the ultimate confirmation that the symptom can be fundamentally organic, not just psychological. It demonstrates that the delusion isn't necessarily some deeply rooted psychological defense mechanism, but can be an acute manifestation of neurotoxicity that is, thankfully, pharmacologically reversible.
Okay, so we've covered this incredible variety of triggers, from severe depression to TBI to epilepsy to specific chemical poisoning, and they all somehow funnel down to this one universal, terrifying outcome: the negation of self. So the big question is, what does this all mean? How does a physical injury or a chemical imbalance or a mood disorder actually translate into the subjective experience of being dead? What's going on in the brain?
This brings us squarely into the realm of neurobiological hypotheses. And the leading ideas attempt to unify Cotard syndrome with its cousin, Capgras delusion, which we discussed earlier.
The imposter delusion.
Exactly. They're hypothesized to be related because both might stem from a specific failure in one of the brain's core information processing subsystems.
Which subsystem is that?
The system that links raw sensory recognition, like seeing your hand, or recognizing a familiar face, with the absolutely essential feeling of familiarity and ownership that should accompany it. You know, the feeling that that hand is yours, that face is known.
So normally when I see my own reflection or feel my own heartbeat, there's an instantaneous, probably subconscious, affective ping that confirms, yes, this is known, this is me, this is real.
That's precisely the affective pathway we're talking about. It provides the emotional context, the feeling of realness. Now, in Capgras, that specific affective pathway seems to break down primarily for external stimuli, particularly familiar people. That leads to the misidentification. Looks like mom, but doesn't feel like mom, therefore imposter.
Okay.
In Cotard syndrome, the hypothesis is that this dysfunction is far more severe and much more generalized. The patient experiences perhaps a total loss of this affective response, not just to external people, but to everything,
Everything.
including their own body, their own thoughts, their own existence. This results in profound derealization, the world feels utterly unreal, and depersonalization. The self feels utterly flat, unreal, unknown.
So the fundamental feeling of being alive, the sort of emotional heat required to confirm existence, just goes offline. The brain is presented with a body that looks alive, objectively, but feels profoundly non-familial, alien even.
Precisely. The sensory input is there, but the emotional tag, the feeling of mindness or realness, is completely absent. And this profound disconnect sets the stage for the two-factor hypothesis.
Okay, the two-factor hypothesis. This is the leading model for explaining why patients cling to the delusion, right? Even when there's overwhelming evidence they're breathing, talking, eating, that they are in fact alive.
Exactly. You need both factors working together, or rather failing together, to really lock in that I am dead narrative.
Let's unpack those two factors clearly for everyone listening. What is factor one, the initial break?
Factor one is this affective loss, or sensory disconnect. It's the neurological failure we just described, a total lack or a severe reduction in the normal autonomic visceral response to both internal and external stimuli.
What does that mean, an autonomic response?
It means the subtle, unconscious physical reactions your body has, like a tiny change in heart rate or skin conductance, the galvanic skin response when you see something familiar or emotionally significant. In these patients, that differential autonomic responsivity is lost or flattened.
So, when they look at a loved one or hear their own name or feel their own heartbeat, there's no corresponding gut feeling, no physical ping of recognition.
Exactly. Nothing that viscerally screams reality or familiarity. The experience becomes one of profound generalized indifference or unreality. The fundamental feeling of being alive has vanished because of this break, likely in the connections between sensory processing areas and the limbic system, the brain's emotional core.
So, factor one. The input is technically correct, the heart is beating, the face is recognized visually, but the crucial visceral confirmation, the feeling of it being real and mine, is completely absent. The emotional sensor is broken.
There's factor one.
Okay, if that's the case, why don't they just conclude something's wrong with my feelings or my brain must be damaged? Why leap to the incredibly extreme conclusion, I must be dead?
That requires factor two. Cognitive failure. This is the brain's inability to reject that highly improbable, frankly bizarre hypothesis, I am dead, as the explanation for the profound affective vacuum they're experiencing.
So the reasoning part of the brain fails to correct the error.
Essentially, yes. This failure is specifically tied to dysfunction in the brain's executive control system, its internal reality checker. Particularly, researchers point to the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the RDLPFC.
Okay, the RDLPFC, what does that part of the brain normally do in this context?
The RDLPFC is a critical hub for higher-level executive functions: reasoning, planning, working memory, and importantly, error checking and hypothesis evaluation. It's responsible for taking conflicting information, weighing evidence, and overriding incorrect assumptions or internally generated errors.
So normally if the thought I am dead pops into my head, my RDLPFC instantly flags it as absurd based on all the incoming data I'm thinking, I'm breathing, I feel my body.
Precisely. It evaluates the hypothesis against reality and rejects it. In Cotard syndrome, however, damage, or more likely hypofunction-reduced activity in the RDLPFC, means this critical intellectual vetting mechanism fails.
So the RDLPFC doesn't step in and say, wait a minute, that makes no sense. It fails to veto the nihilistic explanation.
That seems to be the case. The patient is left stranded with a body in a world that doesn't feel alive or real, factor one, and crucially, a faulty reasoning system, factor two, that fails to reject the bizarre conclusion derived from that feeling. The delusion gets locked in place because the part of the brain that should challenge it is offline or impaired.
It's the cognitive mechanism failing to correct the sensory or emotional error. The intellectual knowledge that they are alive becomes completely powerless because the emotional, visceral knowledge is missing, and the brain region responsible for critically challenging the bizarre idea isn't doing its job.
You've got it. It's a devastating combination.
And we actually have neuroimaging evidence, brain scans, that support these ideas of structural and functional breakdowns.
We do, yes. Structural imaging, like MRI scans, sometimes points towards multifocal brain atrophy, meaning shrinkage in multiple areas, and also ventricular enlargement, which can indicate loss of brain tissue. These findings often point towards widespread dysfunction in that frontotemporal parietal circuitry we keep mentioning.
The areas for self-perception, identity, integrating reality.
Exactly those areas. But it's the functional scans, the SPECT and PET studies, which measure brain activity and metabolism, that really reveal what's happening in terms of brain function.
What do those show?
Functional studies like SPECT, which measures blood flow, and PET-D, which measures glucose metabolism, have quite consistently reported decreased regional cerebral blood flow, or hypoperfusion hypometabolism, in key cortical areas.
Hypoperfusion, meaning low blood flow, low activity.
Exactly. Low activity, low energy use. These areas are essentially running on low power. Commonly implicated areas include the left temporal lobe, parietal lobes, and crucially those frontal lobes, including the prefrontal cortex where the RDL-PFC resides.
So if the brain regions responsible for generating the feeling of self, for evaluating reality, are literally running on low power, it makes sense they wouldn't be generating the signal of life or correcting errors effectively.
Precisely. The reduced metabolism could directly lead to the cognitive and emotional deficits we see. And the most compelling, almost frightening piece of functional evidence comes from that case of Graham.
Graham, the patient who believed he had basically fried his brain after a suicide attempt and felt he was dead or undead.
That's the one. Dr. Stephen Lauries, a leading consciousness researcher in Belgium, performed a PET scan on Graham to measure his brain's metabolic activity. The results were, frankly, extraordinary.
This was the waking coma scan, right?
That's what some called it, yes. Graham's brain activity, particularly in large swaths of his frontal and parietal lobes, the very areas responsible for conscious awareness, integrating information, self-awareness, intentional action, was so incredibly diminished.
Oh, diminished.
So diminished that the functional scan actually resembled that of a patient under deep general anesthesia or someone in a vegetative or minimally conscious state.
But he wasn't in a coma. He was awake.
That's the astonishing part. He was awake, sitting up, interacting, conversing with the researchers. Yet, metabolically speaking, large parts of his brain were operating at levels usually associated with profound unconsciousness.
That is truly profound. It wasn't just that he thought his brain was dead. Functionally, in key areas, it was performing almost as if it were.
The interpretation was that this profound reduction in brain metabolism was likely the direct physiological cause of his altered experience of the world, his feeling of unreality, and his compromised ability to perceive his own existence. His delusion, in a way, was the tragically accurate psychological interpretation of a profoundly dysfunctional physical state within his own brain.
When you see data like that, it really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? We move beyond seeing it purely as a psychiatric diagnosis and into the realm of hard neurology, a failure of the biological machinery of consciousness.
Absolutely. It highlights the biological underpinnings in a very stark way.
The science behind the delusion is fascinating, absolutely. But we have to shift focus now to the clinical reality for patients experiencing Cotards, because it sounds like a state of extreme immediate danger.
It absolutely is. The clinical ramifications demand urgent, often life-saving intervention.
Yeah.
Because the patient acts in ways that are congruent with their delusion.
They behave as if they're dead.
Precisely. And the most immediate danger stemming from that is self-starvation. They simply refuse to eat or drink.
Why?
The reasoning from their perspective is horribly logical. I am dead. A corpse has no need for sustenance. Therefore, why should I eat?
Gosh, that sounds like it would lead to a rapid physical decline.
It does. This persistent refusal leads inevitably to severe malnutrition, significant weight loss, dangerous nutritional deficiencies, and potentially life-threatening metabolic crises, like diabetic ketoacidosis if they happen to be diabetic. We see case reports describing patients with body mass indexes, BMIs, down as low as 15, which is severely underweight.
So self-neglect is that profound.
Utterly profound. And it almost invariably necessitates involuntary commitment to a hospital and treatment over objection, simply to keep them alive, to prevent them from literally starving themselves to death based on this delusion.
Beyond the immediate danger of starvation, the suicide risk must be incredibly high as well, given the likely underlying depression and just the sheer existential terror of their perceived state.
It is one of the highest risks associated with this syndrome, yes.
Yeah.
The severe distress, sometimes those intense feelings of damnation or guilt we talked about, combined with the nihilistic belief that life has already ended or is meaningless. It leads to frequent, sometimes quite bizarre or determined suicide attempts.
Trying to end a life they believe is already over.
Or perhaps trying to escape the perceived state of undead suffering. However, there is a critical warning here for clinicians and families, something that might seem counterintuitive.
What's that?
The risk of suicide often remains high and can sometimes even become more pronounced during the initial stages of recovery.
Really? Why would the risk peak when they're actually starting to get better? That doesn't seem logical.
It's a paradox of recovery. When patients are in the absolute depths of their illness, maybe severely depressed, catatonic, psychotically withdrawn, like in some type 2 cases, they might actually be too physically inactive, too slowed down, or too emotionally blunted to successfully plan and carry out a suicide attempt.
They lack the energy or motivation.
Exactly. But as they start to respond to treatment, maybe medication or ECT, their mood might lift slightly, their energy levels might return, their motivation can increase.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Unfortunately, if the core nihilistic beliefs or the profound sense of hopelessness haven't fully resolved yet, they now possess the renewed physical capacity and drive to act on suicidal plans they might have formed earlier but couldn't execute.
So they regain the means before they lose the motive.
That's a very good way to put it.
Yeah.
Clinicians and caregivers must be acutely aware of this dangerous window during the recovery phase.
Yeah.
Vigilance is key.
Okay, given the extreme agency, the risk of severe malnutrition, the high suicide risk, what is considered the most effective and often the most rapidly acting treatment pathway according to the literature?
Based on case reports and clinical experience, because we last large randomized trials, due to the rarity, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, remains the most frequently reported and arguably the most robustly supported treatment strategy.
ECT?
Yes, especially in cases where the clinical picture involves severe psychotic depression, features of catatonia, or when there's an imminent life threat due to that refusal to eat or drink. ECT tends to work relatively quickly and can be effective in resolving both the severe depressive symptoms and the associated nihilistic delusions.
What's the thinking behind why ECT might be particularly effective for disrupting this specific bizarre delusion?
Well, ECT involves inducing a brief controlled seizure under anesthesia. This controlled seizure causes a massive synchronized burst of electrical activity throughout the brain, effectively resetting abnormal patterns of neural communication.
Like rebooting a computer.
That's a common analogy, yes. The action is hypothesized to help normalize the dysfunctional brain circuitry, particularly the pathways involved in mood regulation, but also potentially those critical frontotemporal pathways, like the ones involving the RDLPFC, that seem to be failing in their role of reality testing and hypothesis evaluation. Factor 2.
So it might address both factors.
It might help improve both the mood, Factor 1 related issues, and the cognitive processing, Factor 2 failure. Successful recovery from Cotard symptoms has been documented after a course of ECT, sometimes needing as few as 7 to 12 treatments.
That's relatively quick in psychiatric terms?
It can be, yes. And interestingly, we even have some rare reports of spontaneous recovery from Cotards after patients suffered 2 naturally occurring grand mal seizures, which further hints at the potential for significant electrical brain activity to disrupt this specific delusional mechanism.
Okay, so ECT is a primary tool, especially in severe cases. But what if ECT isn't immediately available, or perhaps in less severe cases, maybe type 1 or less acute type 2? What pharmacological strategies, what medications are used? You mentioned the lack of big trials.
Right, so treatment largely relies on following established guidelines for the underlying condition, usually psychotic depression, combined with insights from published case reports. And because of the severity, it often requires quite aggressive combination pharmacological strategies. Monotherapy sometimes works, but combination is common.
What kind of single drugs have shown some success?
Well, case reports mention effectiveness with certain antipsychotics like aripiprazole or olanzapine, sometimes SSRI antidepressants like fluoxetine on its own, or mood stabilizers like lithium. But again, given the complexity, monotherapy might not be enough for the most severe presentations.
So the cocktail approach is more typical. Give us some examples of combinations that have been reported as effective.
Sure. Successful combinations reported in the literature include things like an older antipsychotic, haloperidol, combined with the antidepressant mirtazapine, or a newer antipsychotic like risperidone, combined with the SSRI sertraline.
Okay.
More complex regimens might involve olanzapine, combined with escitalopram, and maybe lorazepam for anxiety. And in very treatment-resistant cases, the potent, atypical antipsychotic clozapine might be used, often combined with antidepressants like fluvoxamine or even older tricyclics like imipramine.
It sounds like doctors often have to try several combinations. But the sources we looked at seem to specifically advocate for one particular dual therapy. especially in severe psychotic depression linked with Cotards.
Yes, that's right. There is significant positive reporting, particularly in case series, for the specific combination of olanzapine and fluoxetine.
Olanzapine, the antipsychotic, and fluoxetine, the SSRI antidepressant.
Correct. This specific dual therapy has shown marked success, sometimes even in patients whose psychotic depression was so severe that ECT was being considered as the very next step. In some documented instances, this particular combination proved potent enough to completely resolve the symptoms and circumvent the need for ECT.
Why might that specific combination be particularly effective against the nihilism? What's the theory?
The hypothesis centers on potential synergistic effects on key neurotransmitter systems, particularly dopamine and serotonin. It's thought that this combination might effectively target both factors of the two-factor model we discussed.
How so?
Olanzapine is an atypical antipsychotic that strongly modulates dopamine activity, which is crucial for managing psychosis, and might also influence executive functions linked to that factor 2 cognitive failure. Fluoxetine, as a potent SSRI, dramatically increases serotonin levels, which is vital for lifting the underlying severe depression and potentially mitigating the melancholic guilt often associated with factor 1.
So boosting both systems might help correct the underlying issues.
The idea is that the combined action enhances neurotransmitter activity in key brain areas, possibly helping to restore more normal function in the prefrontal cortex, addressing factor 2, while simultaneously lifting the severe affective disturbance, addressing factor 1. It's a compelling rationale for why that specific pair might be particularly effective.
Makes sense. Finally, beyond ECT and medication, what about psychological support and other non-medical interventions? Do they play a role?
Absolutely. While they might not cure the underlying biological pathology on their own, psychosocial support is invaluable, especially during recovery and for long-term well-being.
Like therapy?
Yes. Psychotherapy, including approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can be crucial for helping the patient process the traumatic experience of the delusion, rebuild their sense of self, manage residual symptoms, and prevent relapse. But even before formal therapy is fully possible, something simpler is vital.
What's that?
Frequent reassurance from loved ones, from nursing staff, from doctors, just repeatedly, gently, consistently orienting the patient back to reality.
Countering the delusion directly.
Not necessarily arguing, but providing evidence. There's one powerful case report that highlighted how a patient slowly began her recovery by starting to identify small elements that actively contradicted her delusion. Things like feeling her own heartbeat, recognizing the internal drive to eat, experiencing physical pain.
Tiny anchors back to reality.
Exactly. These small, undeniable facts of physical existence, when pointed out and reinforced repeatedly by support of others, provided the fragile tether she needed to start pulling herself back from the brink of non-existence.
It sounds like a slow, incredibly patient process of helping someone rebuild their subjective reality, almost one denied heartbeat, one recognized hunger pang at a time.
It often is. It requires immense patience and empathy. The prognosis overall is quite varied. It depends heavily on the underlying cause and the response to treatment. But the good news, the hopeful message, is that complete recovery can occur. Sometimes it happens spontaneously, sometimes quite suddenly. Even after prolonged periods of severe delusion, recovery is possible. Hashtag outro bio.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating, and I have to say, quite intense journey into a state of profound human suffering, the walking corpse syndrome, Cotard's delusion. We've really seen that this chilling core delusion, the absolute negation of self, isn't some single unified disease. Instead, it seems to be a symptom, a final common pathway perhaps, resulting from the spectacular and diverse range of underlying pathologies.
That's right. Everything from severe psychotic depression to specific brain lesions, neurotoxicity from medications, infections, trauma.
Yeah.
The sheer complexity really underscores the fact that our fundamental sense of self, our feeling of being alive and real, is actually a highly vulnerable neurobiological construct. It's not as immutable as we like to think.
And we tracked how Cotard syndrome is likely rooted, at least according to the leading theories, in this generalized breakdown of the affective system. That vital connection between recognizing our body, our thoughts, the world, and actually feeling that they are real and belong to us.
And the two-factor hypothesis provides a compelling framework for understanding the result. You have this emotional vacuum, this lack of feeling, factor 1, coupled with a catastrophic cognitive failure, likely involving the right prefrontal cortex, that fails to reject the absurd explanation, I am dead, Factor 2.
The profound implication there, for me at least, is that our intellectual self-awareness, our knowledge that we exist, is ultimately insufficient on its own. It seems to need that foundational, visceral, emotional feeling of being alive to sustain itself.
It seems so. When that emotional heat of existence goes out, the logical mind, even if largely intact otherwise, seems to fail to convince itself of reality. And studying this incredibly rare focused delusion actually helps us understand the general architecture of consciousness itself and how it can break down.
Right. And that distinction we discussed earlier about how personality might shape the type of psychosis, the internal attributor tending towards Cotard's, the external attributor towards Capgras.
Yes, that provides a fundamental insight, doesn't it, into how we all construct our realities, perhaps. Delusions aren't just random noise. They often seem to be personalized, horribly logical narratives built upon a foundation of emotional devastation or neurological disruption.
So for you, our listener, perhaps the final thought to contemplate from this deep dive is this. If simply clearing a specific chemical metabolite from the blood through something like dialysis can instantly restore a person's fundamental feeling of existence, where exactly does the boundary lie between the self and the substance, between mind and molecule?
It's a profound question.
The reality seems to be that your sense of being, your very existence as you experience it, is perhaps at times only a breath away or a chemical imbalance away from dissolving entirely. If you found that connection between attribution style and delusional content particularly fascinating, I'd strongly encourage you to explore the literature comparing the psychology of Cotard syndrome and Capgras delusion further. There's a lot more there.
Thank you for joining us for this extraordinarily deep dive into a truly perplexing corner of the human condition.
Indeed. Until next time, stay curious.